Okay, Dustin DiPerna. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be with you. So this is one of the series of interviews that I'm going to be doing for Singularity with um, members or also potential contributors to our International Policy Council.
Right.
And basically we're exploring how different aspects and systems and domains of human culture can be updated and feed into a global humanity that's participating in the earth as a single living system, and how our human systems can be part of that. So you are my go-to guy to speak to around religion and spirituality, and that's something that we've had a really deep brotherhood and friendship around for I don't know how many years now. Must be like since 2011, right? I think it
Yeah,
was. Yeah.
12 years.
Yeah. So I just want to read your bio so that the people who don't know you yet have a sense of what you've been up to. So Dustin DiPerna is a Harvard-trained scholar of world religions. He currently serves as adjunct professor at Stanford University, where he teaches classes on meditation, human flourishing, and purpose finding. Dustin spent 20 years studying with Ken Wilber and is considered an expert in integral theory. He is a senior teacher of Tibetan meditation and studied with his main meditation teacher, Daniel P. Brown, for 16 years. Dustin and Dan co-taught Mahamudra and Dzogchen meditation retreats together for 10 years until Dan's passing. Dustin teaches regularly in the US, Europe, Australia, and China. Through his writing, teaching, and entrepreneurship, Dustin helps people find happier and more fulfilling ways of being in the world. His books include Streams of Wisdom, Evolution's Ally, and Earth is Eden with myself. An avid lover of art, design, and nature, he lives in California with his wife, Amanda, and daughters, Jaya and Rumi. Yeah. So, Dustin, thank you for being up for having this conversation with me.
Thank you, brother. It's so good to be here. Our relationship is a long and deep one, and certainly one of the most profound of my entire life. So any way we can jam together, it's a true pleasure.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. So I would be really curious to start us off with how, if we look at the current global landscape, so we're having this conversation, 2023, we're in the midst of interconnected web of global crises that seems to involve multiple areas of breakdown and schism and polarization that's happening on the planet. A lot of people might have the perspective that speaking about, a global integrative spirituality may seem idealistic, but I would love to hear about, tell me about your work to do with this, your passion in this area, what drives you, your sense of inspiration here, and what you have come to feel is possible around such a thing.
Great. Let's talk about both the big picture and the sort of micro specific picture, if we can.
Mm-hmm.
Big picture, I think having some sort of evolutionary framework is useful, that we understand that the external forms of all these different religious and spiritual traditions will continue to evolve and change. Mm-hmm. But the key piece is holding the essence the same. So the essence stays the same, but the external traditions may evolve. In that way, we're looking at what we might call preservation and innovation. So from the perspective of preservation, we're preserving the essence. From the perspective of innovation, we're always updating traditions to make them legitimate and relevant for a particular moment in time. Because that process is continually ongoing, the evolution is constantly unfolding, there are people that continue to interpret traditions anywhere along that evolutionary spectrum. So some people may take a more traditional view of traditions. Some people may take a more modern view of traditions, and some people may take this more integrative view that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's important to understand that full evolutionary spectrum because it allows each person to be in their own interpretive context, but also allows that you can hold that in a larger frame, that there is an evolutionary journey unfolding. Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of big picture. I think that's true across all traditions. Mm-hmm. More granular perspective, I look at this from particularly the lens through Tibetan Buddhism, which is something that I've studied and practiced for many, many years now. And the same thing holds true, but I can speak with more specificity there, in that these teachings have been around for thousands of years. Some of the more tantric teachings have been around for 1,200 years or so. And in these traditions, the essence always remains the same, but they're always adapted into different cultural contexts and different points in time. So right now we're seeing this amazing transition where the generation before us, my own mentor, Daniel P. Brown, and many others, served as these bridge functions between the indigenous cultures, co-teaching with Tibetans, learning the language, but then translating them natively into our particular context and our time in this moment of where we are as Westerners in the United States, et cetera. And I think that transition signifies that you can preserve the essence of the teachings, but also interpret it or clothe it in different cultural contexts, different appropriateness for different moments. And so I think we're finding that happening across all traditions at this moment. And it's only those traditions that allow themselves to both evolve and recognize that the essence can remain while they evolve, that I think will really be able to participate in this more integrative global spirituality. If we maintain some sort of traditional lens where we're exclusively identified with our particular tradition, and we think all the traditions are wrong, or we have this kind of black and white thinking in our tribalism, I think we get into tricky territory. And although we can honor that as a legitimate spectrum, perspective on the spectrum, I'm not sure how useful that more traditional view is in trying to work towards a global spirituality where we see things in a more integrative lens. So some sort of evolution and adaptation and distinguishing the difference between essence and its expression is going to be important for a global spirituality to flourish. So a lot of my work in Streams of Wisdom, Evolution's Ally, Earth is Eden with you, has looked at the relationship between the essence and its expression, or preservation and innovation, and tried to understand that spectrum of how religions can show up and how they can participate in a global spirituality.
Yeah, beautiful. So let me just reflect back to you, because there's a lot that you just shared. Let me reflect back to you what feel like some really important points, just to make sure that we land them fully. What you're sharing is that even though for most people, perhaps looking out onto the contemporary religious landscape, what may be most obvious to see is the traditional forms of religions that have quite bumpy interactions with each other at times, because they are very invested in my tradition to the detriment of others, or one is right and the others are wrong in some way. Even if that is the case, there is an evolutionary current of life, which is just part of the way of things, that means that there are also further layers of how religious traditions can unfold themselves that have a willingness to be more interconnected and embracing with the rest of the world, and in more open relationship with other religious traditions. And so you mentioned there's a traditional form that religions can express through, but then there's also a modern form, and I think we'd say there's a postmodern form, and then an integral form, and so on. And as people within a religious tradition themselves grow in these ways and are open to explore what are new innovations and expressions of their religious tradition that, as you say, doesn't lose the essence of it, but at the same time updates itself into these more embracing evolutionary layers, then we start to see something else evolve. We start to see religions starting to be willing to participate in a global, interconnected, mutually seeing, mutually enriching expression of religion and spirituality. Does that feel right?
Great. Beautiful. You said it better than I did. That's great. So one of the things I want to just build on that is that, we have a tendency to objectify religion as if it's a thing. And right. That's part of the sort of modern mindset. We sort of make all these categories and we say, well, there's this religion, there's this religion, there's this religion, putting things into nice, neat boxes. Mm-hmm. But what we sometimes forget is that religions are practiced and interpreted by human beings. Mm-hmm. And because they're practiced, interpreted, and enacted by human beings, we have to take into consideration the levels of development that each human being is bringing to interpret the tradition. So just like you're saying, that expression has to do with the interpretation that each human being is bringing to it. So as humans evolve in their own unique spiritual evolution, so too does their expression of the particular tradition that they're a part of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important. One of the metaphors that I used to use often is that if we think about the journey from more of a traditional spirituality to something we might call a translineage spirituality, we can think about various metaphors. So at the beginning, at the traditional mindset, there's basically you're sure that your view is right and everybody else is wrong. At a modern view, you start to develop some tolerance. So you know that your view is still right, but you're willing to be you're willing to talk and be inclusive of other people. So it's like you're willing to shake hands. You can shake hands with other people. You're tolerant of them. As the just grows and develops, and we develop more of a postmodern orientation towards spirituality, we start to have this view where, well, maybe we actually can dialogue with each other and learn something from each other. So there's some humility that evolves, and we actually start to exchange ideas and realize that there are certain blind spots that my tradition has that yours might fill out, and vice versa. So there's a true dialogical exchange. The whole field of interreligious dialogue was birthed from that level of development. But what we're saying here is maybe there's also something else possible. Maybe there's something beyond this sort of simple dialogue. So it's a bit provocative, but I'm going to use it, recognizing it might be provocative. So what happens when, instead of just dialoguing with each other, and we have our robes on being representatives of all these traditions, what happens if we enter into a room together and we drop our robes and we actually just stand nakedly as human beings together, and we allow for there to be a full union of the best of what it means to be human, synthesized into a single lineage of humanity. So this great human tradition, or this great human lineage, is something that I think we're moving towards. But it requires us to move beyond our exclusive identification with self or with a tradition. And what that opens a doorway for is a truly translineage spirituality, where we together can stand in as human beings, including our differences in culture, language, context, recognizing all the important contributions of postmodernity, but also now standing in a unified trajectory as human beings, representing the great human tradition or the great human lineage of Earth. Then we're talking about our Earth spirituality, a human wisdom tradition that's in that way universal, that doesn't exclude differences, but actually stands for the true synthesis of all those coming together. So one of my mentors, Ken Wilber, used to use this metaphor. He said the vision that he kept seeing was that, all these different colored lights from the different traditions are shining into a single spectrum that becomes the single beam of light, the single of clear light or white light. And so what does that translineage transition look like? And I think what's important to recognizing is that in that stance of a translineage spirituality, we always have the capacity to put back on our robe and look back down the particular stream that we came from and serve beings as they evolve through that unique stream. I can look into the Tibetan Buddhist stream and help beings evolve, but simultaneously I can look forward into the future as a single being and actually manifest something that's translineage beyond that particular tradition. And I think that's the direction that we're headed as humanity. And that's a lot of what you and I have written about and you and I have explored. So just wondering how that lands with your thinking now and what you're working.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to just be with what you just shared a minute again, because it feels that feels really significant. And first, I want to pick up on your use of these terms, traditional, modern, and postmodern, because I think it's just really worthwhile to point out, first of all, that these are really the kind of all of our collective culture wars generally are actually happening between these different sections of society. That we have there's each of these kind of layers of the evolutionary spectrum, or the trajectory of growth that happens within human beings and traditions and so on, involves differences of values, and a lot of the conflict that exists in the world today exists between healthy and unhealthy forms of the traditional layer, where people have very traditional values of absolute ideas of right and wrong, and if you do this, then you always go to heaven. If you do this, then you always go to hell, and reward and punishment are what are waiting for people who obey or do not obey the laws of how everything works, and it's in group and out group and so on. And then the next kind of strata of society, those with very modern, rationalistic, achiever-based, scientifically informed business, kind of friendly. And of course, this is a gross generalization. And then, we have so much of actually the crisis that's happening in the world today as well in the postmodern area, where there's people have, very pluralistic, diversity infused and diversity celebrating, and, values that are embracing multiple cultures and multiple perspectives and so on. And and what you're speaking to is that, and I guess what I'm interested in here as well is, if I look into the tension that I see that's happening in the world today, I think a lot of the challenge is that there's those three kind of sections of society, at least, bumping up really intensely against each other. And I think each of them has important pieces for what we intuitively can feel as a healthy and whole human life, but none of them include an integration of all of those pieces. And so, all of them are lacking in some way, despite their claims. And what you're speaking to is the emergence of a next layer, which embraces all of these and their contributions, but also holds it within a wider context, and that as an expression of religious tradition. So, and I really feel you around you speaking about the great human tradition, because that's when you speak about that, it kind of taps me directly back into a lot of our work and our passion, which has always been around, honoring and welcoming the gifts and areas of wisdom and profound cultural innovation of different religious and spiritual traditions over time from all parts of the world, from the Himalayas through to the jungles of South America, or, through to the plains of North America, through to, to India and China and Japan and so on. But recognizing that each of them has a piece of the question of what it means to be a whole, flourishing human being, and that's a piece that you've written about a lot, which is, to be able to see religions as conveyor belts for human development, that they play a unique function in that role. But I think something that I've loved our dialogues and our work around in the past is around, there's an idea that a lot of people have, which is that ultimately all these different traditions are saying the same thing. And something that I love that we've gone really deep into is the understanding that that's not actually the case, that they're not actually saying the same thing, that it's the picture is far richer than that they are often speaking to different aspects of growth and human potential, that when you get that, then there's an opportunity to put them together and to have something emerge which has never been seen before. In terms of, and that's what you're speaking to with the great human tradition. And when we have that conversation, it's part of a lineage of people having that conversation, like Adi Da, was speaking about the great human tradition, a controversial figure who we recognize some of the challenges there, and also, the incredible genius and innovation at the same time. And Ken Wilber then, and you've written on it, and we've written on it. So maybe you can speak a bit to that piece around, because I remember actually even some of the first conversations that we ever had where you were sharing with me some of your ways of seeing this, some of your ways of seeing that different religious traditions are, first of all, offering pathways for human growth and development, but they're actually offering pathways to different aspects of human growth and development. And I'd be curious how you see that now, like 12 years later.
Yeah. So I just love speaking with you about this, John, because it's such an exciting part of, I think, how both of us feel our own purpose activated in the world and how we're contributing and participating.
Yeah.
So I want to speak about alpha and omega cultures for a moment and these different religious traditions. And you mentioned Adi Da, who's a controversial and also quite brilliant spiritual realizer of the past 20, 30 years. He died in 2008. So I think he called this idea the great tradition of humankind, that all of humanity is one great tradition of humankind. And one of the things that he spoke about is that if we look at, even in the simplest way, of traditions that tend to be more, he framed it over, simplistically painting broad strokes. Some traditions are what he called alpha cultures or alpha traditions. Those alpha traditions are those traditions that focus on meditative awareness and tracing awareness back to its source. So track back to the original nature, original ground, the alpha. Those traditions, like say Buddhism or some of the various Hindu traditions, are all about tracing awareness back to its source till you recognize that single unified wholeness, that non-dual ground at the base of our very awareness. But he said there are other cultures that focus, he calls them omega cultures, omega traditions, that are more about manifestation in and through the body into the world in the ways that we end up creating heaven on earth. So they're future oriented. It's about both healing the world and creating this world as Eden. And so when he spoke about those cultures, he said, Christianity and Judaism, the Abrahamic traditions, are more these omega traditions, omega cultures. And what he proposed, and it's a simplistic variation, but I think it's easy for folks to understand, is that we're at a point in time now in a global spirituality and the great tradition of humankind to develop both an alpha and omega tradition. There's an alpha and omega emergence where we have human beings who are both recognizing that ground and that source while simultaneously embodying in the world to create this heaven on earth, or the earth as Eden. That practice of holding both those views simultaneously is, I think, another key component of this global spirituality that you and I are both so interested in. That it's not an either or, but it's a full realization that it's fully penetrating the world, fully here, and fully manifesting this evolutionary potential. So it has both the radical awakening piece and the evolutionary awakening piece that you and I are passionate about. So I think that's important to name. But I want to say one more thing, and that's a potential error that's happened historically with people talking about global spirituality. And it might be a little technical, but it feels important to name it. And that's that with the emergence of modernity, there's often conversations that start to emerge about world spirituality, global spirituality, et cetera. But often those conversations are proposed by specific groups of people with their own bias, thinking that they're going to have this sort of colonial view of what that is. What is the global spirituality? When you pass through a truly authentic postmodern sensitivity, what starts to happen is that you develop this capacity for understanding that there is so much diversity in the world and there's so much difference, that healthy pluralism, that it's never going to be one group or one person who's deciding what a global spirituality is. It has to be by its very nature dialogical. It has to pass through that postmodern lens. It has to, by its very nature, be polycentric, meaning that its center is everywhere. It's not just going to have one center and one group of people who are deciding it. So it's decentralized. And when you start to understand that it has to be dialogical, polycentric, that it's always emergent and growing, I think that provides a bit more sort of healthy framework to understand what a true translineage spirituality looks like. That it's not something that I think people worry about, that it's going to be some sort of group of people who are deciding what this global spirituality is. It's not like that at all. It's much more organic than that, because it's passed through that sensitivity of understanding it needs to be dialogical, decentralized, et cetera, while simultaneously not losing the depth. And so the depth of authentic realization has to still shine through. And there will be a natural hierarchy that emerges as things progress, but that'll be based on true realization. It'll be based on the goodness that beings and people bring into the world. So I think it's important to mention that so as not to set off alarm bells for too many people worrying about some new form of colonialism.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just remembering that those are key aspects of the work that you've done around the emergence of a global spirituality, that it would need to be dialogical, decentralized, and polycentric. And I think what that speaks to for me as well, particularly the polycentric aspect, is that the emergence of something like this really is an expression of life itself emerging at its next level of complexity. And I think, that's something which I am passionate about, looking out into the world in this time of great crisis and multiple areas of interconnected crisis and so on, is to be able to see that through the frame of an evolutionary tension, that we are under great evolutionary tension at the present time. And for anyone who has been on their path for a while, we know that suffering is basically everyone's first teacher, right? And we know that it is through huge times of tension and pressure that new levels of evolutionary development in ourselves and also in the collective become possible. So, and that's just because that kind of movement into a deeper and fuller and wider embrace of life is inherent in life itself. So, you know, that's what we're speaking to here. We're speaking to the way that life wants to evolve and unfold and develop its expression through the field of religion and spirituality. And, you know, just the piece that you shared at the end reminded me of another area that we've been really inspired by, which is the emergence of, you know, really trustable, awake, integrated spiritual leaders, right? You know, and I don't know if you saw, because I know you sometimes look at the news and sometimes don't, I think, but like, I know if you saw the thing that happened recently with the Dalai Lama.
I did.
Right. So that's just a really good example, right, of how much charge there exists in the collective around whether our religious and spiritual leaders are trustable, whether they really are to be looked up to. Of course, there's such a massive, profoundly trauma-infused history of abuses of power and abuses of privilege that exist among spiritual leaders. And, you know, I think something that we've both been passionate around is like, okay, well, there's actually an application of the bringing, if we do see that in those aspects of every religious tradition and spiritual path that have been custodians of important contributions to how human beings grow and human potential, if we start to put those together, then we start to have an incredible, holistic, integrated picture of all the different areas of human potential being able to blossom, from radical awakening to personality integration to heart opening to much deeper multidimensional engagement with the earth and nature and so on. We put all of that together, then the application of that, the possible fruit of that, is an altogether different kind of human being, and therefore also a different kind of spiritual leader. You know, so I think this also, I can feel the place in me that longs for the emergence of those spiritual leaders, you know, who I can feel in my heart and in my body are embodying depths of human maturity and possibility that exist in all of us, and who are trustable in the way they hold power, and also invite all of us into a deeper recognition of the beauty of what life and reality are. And I wonder, you know, if you can speak to how you see that conversation, you know, at the moment as well.
Well, I'm happy to, but let me ask you first, how would we know that those spiritual leaders or beings, like, how do we know them? How would we recognize them? Because I think that's an even deeper question in a certain way. So how would you recognize them? What frameworks would you have?
You know, what I've experienced with my teachers and mentors, some of the qualities that I've recognized in them is that there's just obviously deeper levels of wisdom, integration of the human experience, capacity to lovingly embrace whatever is arising while simultaneously being in honest connection with their own process. You know, with one of my teachers, Bruce, one of the things I've seen again and again and again, I've seen him in so many different, with so many different groups of people, you know, men, women, multiple different cultures and areas of life represented. And in pretty much every single one of those contexts, I've seen those people find parts of their own humanity in him. They felt themselves in him. They felt themselves represented in him. Even though they come from so many different aspects of life. And that's been an inspiration to me. Yeah, for me, it's when I can feel that someone has cultivated and is speaking from something that feels true in me, but to a deeper level than I have had access yet. And the degree to which my integrity radar, as imperfect as it may be, or as, just good enough as it may be, feels solid, with the way I'm experiencing this human being show up. Those are a couple.
Yeah. So I want to build on it because, your question was like, how do I see sort of this more integrated dimension of humanity and these beings sort of emerge? Let's take this idea of Christ being fully divine, fully human. I think that's a good starting point. That anybody who, different traditional, different worldviews are going to take this differently, as with everything. But if we say at the base level that Christ was a good example, it was a good example that we can begin to emulate. That as we develop what you and I have called radical realization, which is the realization of our true nature, this is what some of the great spiritual traditions call awakening, or eventually what would become full enlightenment. Part of that realization is to also be fully in contact with our humanity. And this is eventually what the Buddhist tradition calls the three Buddha bodies. We're fully in contact with the depth of everything being one single unified sphere, totally empty and wide open and vast. We're in contact with everything being deeply sacred. And we're in contact with how things appear. And how things appear is all of our vulnerabilities and our humanities. So I think a place to start is, are we drawing from all the resources we have as a human species to both access our divinity and access our humanity? Are we drawing from the resources that help us stabilize these deeper sense of radical awakening? Are we drawing from all the psychological resources, the medicine traditions, the traditions of somatic healing and integration, from psychotherapy to psychoanalysis? Are we drawing from all the traditions to actually become fully human, a fully healthy, integrated, moral human being? And what we sometimes see happen is that some people lean towards one of the sides of the spectrum or the other side. Sometimes people go, to the top of the mountain and stay there. And they have this sense of realization, but it's not integrated with their humanity. Sometimes people are deeply integrated human beings, but don't have the realization. And of course, what we're looking for is relative wholeness as a human being and ultimate wholeness as a divine being. And as we develop both ultimate wholeness and relative wholeness, I think that's the pathway by which we begin to integrate and synthesize the gifts of what it means to integrate these human traditions. So any sort of great spiritual tradition for all of humanity, any sort of translineage realization would have to emulate that fundamental archetype that we have in Christ of being fully divine, fully human, or the Buddha of having full realization and all three Buddha bodies fully available. So it's an integrated realization by its very nature. And I think we feel that when we're around certain beings, just like you're saying. We have to trust our own intuition that we can feel that someone feels deeply integrated, deeply whole, and someone is holding a level of depth that's compelling. Something is drawing us forth to levels that we don't understand. So I'm just excited to continue to explore that and what that looks like and how we find more examples of that. Not by making it based on external criteria, but more in the sense of like, are people feeling, do they feel whole? Do they feel like they're in integrity with their own being? And I think one of the ways we know that, which I also learned from you and from Bruce, is that true power always empowers. True power actually helps bring forth greatness and confidence in others. And that a power that actually strips that away from others, that it disempowers, is actually not the kind of power that we're talking about. We're talking about an inspiring power that actually brings forth others' potential to their fullest extent. So in that sense, teachers are always teaching by the way of being. And I think that's something you and I are both interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just considering as well as we're speaking that I can feel like one of the things people long for deeply as well, and myself included, is basically spiritual leaders who have reconciled some of the most sticky areas of human activity and experience, namely kind of power, sex, and money. That is where there's so many get tripped up. And I think that's a very alive thing in people's current sense of the field of spiritual teachers and leaders across traditions, is the prevalence of scandals basically that arise even among, and that's probably why the Dalai Lama thing recently was so quick to light up, because of the prevalence of, it's one aspect of it, the prevalence of how many scandals there've been among other trusted teachers, where then suddenly there's some recognition, oh, actually there's something that feels grossly out of integrity that was happening around power, sex, or money in some way. And I think that's another piece, which is, conversely, the small number of teachers and spiritual leaders that I've been in contact with who have really captured people's hearts and attention have been beings who seem to have really come to a different stage of relating to those things. They've found their way to the other side, into the sacred, awake expression of those areas in a way that is giving them momentum in their life rather than tripping them up. So I think that's another piece, and I think probably what we would imagine as well is that there are really important contributions. This is all about, the contributions to what it takes to be an integrated human being who's resolved some of the fundamental challenges of being a human being, ranging from being a sexual being, being an embodied being, being a separate, apparently separate being, all of these things. So that as these religious traditions come into this more integral context of revealing and sharing their contributions to the blossoming of what it means to a human being, they probably have various answers, and that they can learn from each other, and we can collectively learn on how to resolve some of the most challenging dimensions of human experience.
Yeah. That's the path we're on.
Yeah, that's the path we're on. So application, Dustin DiPerna, application, political policy. Let's imagine that there is singularity, a transnational political party that starts with the earth as a single living system and humanity as one in, its community of kingdoms, that is emerging into greater and greater political power on the planet, let's say within 10 years from now. What would be healthy, empowering policies that such a political entity could enact that would strengthen the emergence of an integral global spirituality?
Yeah, great. And I think we can go into an incredible amount of nuance and detail here, and we can speak of broad strokes. So let me talk about broad strokes, recognizing that there are gross generalizations.
Yeah.
Broad strokes. Emphasizing policies that give people the time, space, and potential to transcend their own relative sense of contraction as an individual, separate sense of self. Things that actually allow people the freedom and the potential to do things like contemplative practice, that do things like space and everyday life and schools and work, where people recognize and honor the value of going inward, to begin to understand one's own inner nature. That's the key, because unless we have some pause, if we're always focusing outward, we're never going to get the kind of internal transformation that's required for that alpha realization. So creating space, freedom, potential, and honoring the value of things like that, whether it's through funding, whether it's through just explicit values, whether it's through sort of a contemplative bill of rights, who knows what it'll be, but things that actually allow for one to go inward. I think that's critical. Second is somehow rewarding or incentivizing altruism. So somehow rewarding and incentivizing the impulse to contribute to the world at large, So, for example, in the US, we have this program, it's a loan forgiveness program where people go to college and they take out a lot of debt. If they go into professional schools and take out a lot of debt, if they do a career or profession that contributes to the greater social good, the government actually forgives those loans. They actually erase those loans. Things like that on a broader scale, where altruism and doing good work is incentivized, has to be part of the policy. And so that way, what we're doing is we're incentivizing alpha incentives and omega incentives. We're incentivizing and protecting the right for contemplative well-being and going inward. And we're protecting and incentivizing this motivation for deeper goodness outwardly. I think on the broadest level, those two aspects have to be emphasized, protected, and policy has to be built around those domains. I think we could get much more nuance, and we could talk about how do we actually honor in a more detailed way these different stages of development and stages of religious and spiritual expression through evolutionary growing up. How do we somehow honor and recognize the stages of radical awakening through waking up? I think those also become critical pieces. But I think at the beginning, it's like, how do we protect and honor omega values and alpha values in some way? But I don't know, you've thought about this a lot. What do you think? How do you think we start to do this?
I'm just actually remembering, as you are speaking, a conversation I had with a guy that we both know, Thomas Bjorkman, and Thomas wrote this book, The Nordic Secret, which he's really passionate to share with the world, that it was actually through an application of something very similar to what you're describing. There was a whole process where in the Scandinavian countries, and I may get some details wrong here, but in the post-war period, there were public programs that were government funded that provided citizens with the opportunity for retreat time, or kind of regular retreat time. And there were centers that were actually established all over the land of the Scandinavian countries that provided places where people, ordinary citizens could go in a way that was financially supported and have time to reflect and go inward. And that Thomas's point is that this was associated with actually a massive cultural evolution that happened, that the Scandinavian countries, which are generally viewed across the world as being some of the most progressive, that was not where they were in the kind of just immediately post-war period. That there was a huge evolutionary shift that happened because of this. His point is because of these kinds of policies basically that were enacted. So that it's an example of an example of precedent where government policies that make sure that people have the opportunity to do, as you're saying, to have time for contemplative inquiry, for contemplative engagement, is a really healthy thing that greases the wheels of people's opening and development. So I mean, basically what I'm hearing as you're speaking is it's a kind of giant overhaul of the way that we do education, really, and within the context of lifelong human development, that actually we start to see the education process in a much more holistic and integrative way that also includes this broader picture of what's possible in human development, and then welcomes in the spiritual traditions, the religions, their gifts, but also, sees it within the context of education that can support lifelong human development. So that's
critical.
Well, Dustin, thank you so much. I realize that that's our time for today. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. I know we could talk about this a lot more. It's a pleasure, and I really appreciate you sharing your insights into this. And I would love us to talk more about this in the future, and to invite your perspectives into how singularity expresses itself through this domain.
Beautiful. And look forward to continuing to learn from you, brother. It's been such an amazing journey to be on this with you and to be able to share with you. It's truly precious. I care about you so much.
Yeah, I have so much love for you as well.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.